So good afternoon, everyone. Earlier today, we heard from a great panel on the critical infrastructure and resilience, but resiliency actually assumes that you're connected in the first place. So this is where this panel lives, exploring the connectivity and affordability challenges of Canadians. And we've got a great panel here today to talk about it. We have Joel Templeman, the Executive Director of the Internet Society Manitoba chapter and Project Manager for North End Connect, a community network initiative working to expand access in underserved Winnipeg neighborhoods. Next to him, we have Shelley Robson, the Executive Director of National Capital FreeNet, one of Canada's longest-standing community networks, and with a mandate focused on affordable and inclusive connectivity in the Ottawa region. And last but not least, Dr. Michael Geist, who holds the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa, where his research and commentary have made him one of the most prominent voices in Canadian digital policy and law. So before we dig into the questions, I'd like to give each panelist a moment to set the table from their own perspective, and we'll go left to right. Starting with Joel.
Thank you, and hello. In addition to working with the Internet Society and North End Connect, I'm also on the board of Computers for Schools Manitoba, part of the Computers for Schools system, and I'm also halfway through a doctorate at the University of Calgary, specifically in education, looking at hudagogy, which is pedagogy, andragogy, hudagogy, the learning sciences that dictate how you are your own teacher. So that requires technology, it requires access to the internet. So different fields. So that's my background in education. And I spent about 13 years full-time in the military building IT systems. So both sides of the fence, both federally, military, and education. So that's the background that I'm coming from.
Over to Shelley.
My name is Shelley Robinson, Executive Director of National Capital FreeNet. So not-for-profit internet service provider based here in Ottawa, but serving the National Capital Region. First ISP in the region started in 1992. So FreeNets were a burgeoning global moment in the early 90s. So there were 170 FreeNets across the world. There's very few left now. And it was really about providing community portals that were facilitated by dial-up access. And then over time, that dial-up access became sort of more important than the community portal. And so we transmogrified. So we are a wholesale provider of Bell and Rogers internet services for residential subscribers here in town, which is, we'll talk about this, but fundamentally broken model. So we've now transitioned, and we, with support from CIRA, who you heard from today, as well as some other community partners, have built Communify, which is a free to use, not free for us, free to use Wi-Fi network. So it is built in Vanier on top of an Ottawa community housing building. It's a fixed wireless network. So our first two sites connected 4,000 devices in a year, and using Canadian Shield infrastructure blocked more than 150,000 threats. So just getting that out there. And we're trying to pivot into this new model.
Okay, thanks. That sounds awesome. So I'm Michael Geist. I'm a law professor, as you heard, at the University of Ottawa. I focused for a long time on digital policy issues. I'm also a member of the board of the Internet Society that puts this on. And before we get into some of the substantive issues, I just want to say I'm so pleased to both be here and to see this event really thriving. I was a board member of CIRA for a time as well. And one of the things that I really wanted to achieve while being a board member was to try to ensure that CIRA put some money back into the community to support public interest projects, which is now the Community Investment Program or Fund. And this was an early recipient of that. And so it's fabulous to see that it continues to foster dialogue. And the issues have changed, but the need for dialogue from many different perspectives hasn't. And so it's really great to see this continue to thrive.
Thank you, everyone. So I guess the first question I have for all of you is, how do we ensure that sovereign tech investments translate into real affordability and access gains for people? Who wants to go first?
Okay, I can do that. Well, so can I avoid the question? Actually, so I think people like Shelley are going to have a better position to talk about some of the affordability issues. I must admit that I think fundamentally, especially when I hear some of the visions that we see when the notion of sovereignty is framed primarily as an infrastructure play, I think both some of the kinds of affordability issues that we focus on in terms of local access that you've been focused have not been a core part of that discussion. And I think this will make for a really interesting panel to see where some of those connections might exist. But I think more fundamentally, even when it comes to thinking about infrastructure at other levels, sovereignty isn't free. And actually, I do think there is a cost when it comes to some of these issues. And it may well be that Canadians are of the view that that's a price worth paying, that the risks that we face from a sovereignty perspective are such that if it costs more to ensure that we address some of these issues, then that's something worth investing in. What I worry about, and when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you're, I guess, a law professor, everything looks like a legal issue. It seems to me that at times the emphasis on the infrastructure side of it, which is quite clearly may have a correlation to affordability related issues, misses the fact that if sovereignty is fundamentally a legal concept, data sovereignty, if that's what we're talking about, or digital sovereignty is also a legal concept. And the emphasis on infrastructure without as much necessarily emphasis on some of the legal rules surrounding it, and I'm sorry I missed this morning, so some people may have touched on this, I think misses a big part of it. We could, to paraphrase one of the earlier panelists from the last panel, have targets of 50% Canadian or 100% Canadian in 10 years. But if the laws that apply to that, I don't think it's realistic anyway, but if the laws that will apply to it aren't our laws, I don't think it matters if it's 50% or 100% or 10%. And what we need to recognize taking place, and if you'll indulge me for just a moment, this draws on a piece that I had in the Globe a week or so ago. The U.S. has a two-pronged strategy when it comes to this that I think at least the first prong is pretty familiar to everybody here. And so that's often the shorthand is the Cloud Act, this notion that the U.S. asserts jurisdiction over data so long over any company, whether U.S. or Canadian or otherwise, so long as it has some kind of jurisdictional tether to the United States. I'd encourage you to take a look at the request that the province of Alberta has out right now when it comes to issues around infrastructure within the government. And I was talking to the CIO after I did this piece, and he pointed out, if you go to it, go to page 70, in which they identify FISA orders, they identify national security letters, Cloud Act, UK IPA applicability, Australian legislation, Chinese legislation, or any other foreign jurisdiction that seeks to apply its laws onto Canada and would like to find companies that aren't subject to any of those things. I think that's an exceptionally tall order to try to achieve, but it is the challenge that we face on the digital sovereignty piece in terms of ensuring that Canadian law applies. Now, even if we respond to that, I'd also encourage you to take a look at the recent trade barriers report from the United States, in which these issues are now viewed as a trade barrier. They identify 30 plus countries, including Canada, that have tried to take steps towards ensuring some kind of sovereignty, whether that's on the cloud infrastructure side, whether that's on the procurement side, some measures designed to address the very issues we've spent much of the day talking about. And they say all of those things are trade barriers. And so it's a two-pronged strategy. If you try to keep your data here, there's a law that's going to try to say, well, we still may be able to assert jurisdiction. If you try to adopt measures to stop that from happening, they claim that that's a trade barrier. That's the challenge that we face. It's not just an infrastructure one, it's a legal one, and I think we're still trying to sort through what some of the solutions might be.
All right. Can you give me the question again? It's no. I know it, but I want the specificity.
How do we ensure translate into real affordability and access gains for people?
Okay.
Let's see how the community networks do that.
Yeah. So we certainly care and are affected by the broader regulatory environment. And I think regulation is a huge part of this for all players, whether they're big or small, especially in relation to when big telecom in particular gets funding so that they can build out these kinds of big infrastructure plays, then there should be requirements that are around interoperability, which has come up, around maybe seeing inside some of these black boxes, about, we have a situation now where Bell doesn't peer. We talked about IXPs earlier. And so that's something that fundamentally makes the internet stronger, and Bell is choosing not to do. So when we're sort of investing in big companies, then they should have to meet those kinds of requirements. So that's sort of the big player. Locally, one more piece for the regulatory is like give money and carve out a portion of that money for smaller and community investments. So when you think about true resilience, on a network level, or even you want sort of failover, you want to be able to kind of have quick speed and pickup between things. And so when we have this fascination with one or two huge players who are going to an uneasy fascination, I understand, but nonetheless a fascination that the big guys are going to come, they're going to build the one or two big solutions, and that's what's going to do it. And then when that falls apart, we're all freaking out, rightfully. So if you have a whole bunch of smaller things as well as the big, some mid-sized, different business models, all of those things, you're building some of that network infrastructure. So when Rogers goes down and it takes out point of sales at places and cell phones and people's home internet, then they have another place that they can go if there's free Wi-Fi in the city parks, which is something that we're trying to do. So the other thing, just from a sovereignty perspective, so we partnered with EBU Networks here in town. So they're owned by Hydro Ottawa, which in turn is owned by the City of Ottawa. So we're using city and municipally owned infrastructure. Like I said, our tower, the first tower, we're about to build another one, is on Ottawa Community Housing, which again is municipally owned. And so the funding initially came from CIRA. So what we're talking about is two not-for-profits leveraging municipally owned infrastructure so that we can provide this free-to-use service. We host our own data centers. Like we have 2 data centers that we're in here in town, and we have our own servers. We had an opportunity to switch over to AWS, and we were given very favorable rates as a not-for-profit to do it, and we chose not to do it. And now that looks really prescient, you know? So these are the kinds of investments that small orgs can make. Does it cost us more? Yes, because we have to ensure our own network redundancy by buying more machines. But do we think that it bears out? Yes, our email services are locally hosted. So that's something that then just makes these kinds of differences. So that level of community investment can really pay dividends with sovereignty, but you need to have the funding and then the regulations that support and constrain.
Excellent. Sovereignty, autonomy, essentially it's power, right? So looking at it from the most marginalized people that we have, it's power. Power is tied to wealth. Wealth is tied to the politics, right? So when we get down to the policy making, we need to fundamentally rethink how we design things. And so flipping it over, and it's infrastructure, but I'll use an example of accessibility. When we design for accessibility, then everybody is going to benefit from that. So I use wheelchair ramps at schools, right? There was a period of time where the school was built for the majority of people, and there was no way for someone in a wheelchair to easily get into the building. Rights were fought for, and then things were for a while bolted on, added to, and then now you don't have a building that doesn't have that kind of accessibility. But we forget, well, that's not just for wheelchair people. That's for anybody who's carrying something, automatic door openings. I don't know why they have a wheelchair on them. I use them when I have boxes in my hands. If you have, everyone benefits when we design for the most difficult solution, right? So that kind of mentality into tech is a way to completely change, because it's about investment, right? So the dollars are there. We can find the money. Right? There's a robot on Mars right now because we decided to put it there. It's not about the money, it's about the political will and changing the way we're doing it. If you could design for the most marginalized, everything else falls into place. Until we start having that flip of mentality of the way we approach things, there's always going to be a divide. You're always going to get to a point where the market fails, and then everyone else is some other solution. So looking to FreeNet models, community access program models, things we've done in the past, things that Canada was really good at in the 90s and the 2000s that we forgot about, right? So maybe going back and remembering some things. We take things that cost money and give it away for free, so not great business, right? So please help.
And I think that drives into one of the other questions on the agenda really well, is how should governments balance sovereignty, competition, consumer protection, and openness with all these factors at play? Who wants to take a first stab at that one?
Sure. I'm actually usually obsessed. So social enterprise, it means that we're always trying to balance the business parts of of what we do with the social impact parts of it. So I'm obsessed with the concept of trade-offs. So on the face of it, I was like, oh yeah, a trade-off question. And then I was like, am I going to be one of those people who thinks that all of these things benefit each other and it's a virtuous circle? And I am. So I'm not sure that I think that there is such a balancing act that's required. And I think it's come up throughout the day. I, of course, left my notebook at my thing, but like throughout the day, people have been saying things that I'm like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And it is, in fact, I think one of them was the ADM this morning, who talked about how we tend to siloize the three topics that we're talking about today, which is access, open internet, and no, it was AA and OI. Access, no, the theme of the whole day, doesn't matter. Access, autonomy, and open internet. I did AAOI, but it clearly didn't stick well enough. And so how, there can be this false kind of siloization between them. And in fact, they reinforce and overlap. And so that's what I see here. And I would just say as a not-for-profit, obviously, yes, I'm pro-competition, but I would think of it less as competition and as I always have to do a community radio throwout. That's my background. And so community radio doesn't exist in competition with either the CBC or commercial broadcasters. It is seen as one part of this varied system and that they all feed and strengthen Canadians, communities, the listeners, and themselves in different ways. And so it would be the same here. So if we call that multiplicity or something, competition, whatever.
And Michael, maybe you can comment on the regulatory side of this, some of the decisions the CRTC has made and how they impacted this environment.
Yeah, so I mean, that moves us away a little bit from the sovereignty piece into sort of the vision if we were to move back 10 years ago and the vision that we would have a robust independent sector in Canada that would increase the amount of choice and that the regulations would play a key role in facilitating and fostering that which would ultimately lead to better pricing and far more consumer choice. That hasn't panned out in quite the way that I think we had hoped. In large measure, we've seen over the last number of years, many of the independents get swallowed up. And so the amount of choice that we have now is not what the regulatory policy once envisioned, which I think is discouraging, but I think it is where we are at the moment. I think sort of looking back at that, it does highlight the challenge at times of standing up true consumer choice in a space that tends to be dominated by large players. And so we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is to basically answer your question in terms of how do you ensure that there is a Canadian choice as part of some of the procurement practices or other opportunities that are out there that is truly competitive with some of the larger players. And we've seen over many years now, I can think back it's sort of many years where at times there just isn't that choice and it crystallizes in some ways how you lose what you might otherwise want. I can think back. So the first time I started thinking about, we didn't call it data sovereignty at the time, but the first time we started thinking about trying to ensure that Canadian data stayed in Canada dates back to a decision by the BC government to privatize the management of its health data. It was in the roughly early 2000s, and so it put out an RFP for who would manage this health data. And it became readily apparent that the only two companies that were going to have a realistic shot at it were both U.S.-based. This came in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and the passage of the USA Patriot Act. And so at the time, there were a lot of concerns about what would it mean to take this most sensitive of information, health data, and send it to the United States out of government hands. And, the union that was going to be most affected, I think managed to get a lot of play out of this, but they raised what was a real issue. And you began to see various governments seek to respond to that. Well, that's an example, going back now more than 2 decades, of what happens when you don't at least have the domestic choice amongst the range of different choices. And so, I think we can think about what are some of the kinds of criteria that we might want to implement as part of some of these strategies. I alluded to in one of my first remarks about the Alberta document that gives you a sense of some of the kinds of things you have to consider and just how challenging that is. But the goal of at least having the option of being able to say, for certain kinds of data that we might view as the most sensitive or the most high risk, or at a minimum for people that might say, I don't care if it's sensitive or not, I want to have this protection, and I want to know that even if Canadian privacy laws suck, that I'm still going to be subject to those Canadian privacy laws. And we need to find some mechanism to try to achieve that. And that's in part, I think, what this discussion that we're having right now about, well, how do we build up some of these or stand up some of these kinds of Canadian alternatives, so that I don't know that it's about saying that it's always going to be buy Canadian, but I think it should be that we always have the choice to buy Canadian where the circumstances dictate it.
Can I steal it for 1 sec? I feel like I missed this opportunity to complain about the wholesale regulatory system. So let me just say, we're very proud about our Communify project, but the reason that we had to do it was because the CRTC mandated wholesale system that was meant to enable independents to deliver internet services meant that we couldn't fulfill our mandate around affordability. And so the tariff prices were too high. It was never changing. The last 10 years have only been getting worse. And so then we had to look elsewhere. I'm happy that we're doing it, but I'm sad that we had to.
Based off earlier, you're saying sovereignty costs, right? It's about investment. It's about decisions we've made, not 20 days ago, but 20 years ago, right? So a couple of just examples that came to me too. And I think one of the earlier panels, I think it's important to specify Canadian owned doesn't necessarily just mean Canadian headquartered, right? If you can't hack it, you don't own it, right? The right to reuse kind of a mentality. If we individual Canadians don't have a say in what the company is doing or not, then do we really own it? Or is it really sovereignty? I'll use Rogers Satellite as an example. I was happy to hear I'm in Manitoba. I'm from Winnipeg, but I travel in Manitoba. Lots of connectivity problems. Awesome. Satellite. Look up the details. It's Starlink. Who? What? Oh, I have many things about that. Anyway, but nobody asked me, right, about that decision. But that is a massive strategic sovereign decision that was made by a Canadian company. So anyway, that's just one example. The other one is Churchill. So I'm from Manitoba. Anyone been to Churchill, Manitoba?
Oh, wow.
Wow. Okay. I thought this was going to be a more interactive thing. Because the next question was going to be, did you get there by the train that takes 24 hours from Winnipeg to Churchill to get there or to get back? You can fly there too. The reason I bring it up is we have been traditionally a flyover province for a long time. We've been underinvested in, depending on what you look at. We have been either second worst or third worst in connectivity, for lots of time. But all of a sudden, between the global political problems we're having and the climate crisis, Churchill, because it's thawing, is now a strategic it's on the map as far as the government's strategic interests. All of a sudden, all these years of saying, hey, can we have some investment? The only reason there's a fiber line up there is there's a research center up there. So typically really rural and disconnected. But all of a sudden, all this talk's happening. So I was just on the phone with one of the CAO of the town of Churchill, asking about the government's interest in investing and opening the port of Churchill and stuff. These all sound like good economic things. But I said, so what are your interests? What are your real concerns? What is the most important thing with you? And the answer is garbage. They used to incinerate their garbage because of the wildlife that's up there, and especially because of the polar bears. You can't have them coming to a town dump like you do in most of the roads. Their incinerator plant burnt down. I'll give you a second for that. They are in the process of rebuilding it, but they are currently burying garbage because they're so remote. Also, you can't just get rid of it, right? So anyway, there's a longer story to that, but a little bit of irony in it. But most important is, that's not the first thing on their list. Opening the port of Churchill is not the first thing on people who live in Churchill's. And then I said, if the government did suddenly back up a dump truck full of money to open this port, wouldn't that be great though? Wouldn't you then get on the digital train and do all these wonderful things? And it's I don't know where I'm going to house anybody. I don't have enough housing in this town right now to deal with the people it got, let alone a workforce that would have to come in to open a port that's never been done before. Right? So the point is that infrastructure and the assumptions that are made at the government level and the urban level in these marginalized places are very important to consider, because we will be shocked in 10 years when this doesn't work. And it's because we're not listening. We're making assumptions. We're not listening, and we're not solving the real problems. We're like, hey, here's a solution. You're welcome.
Great points, and I love the irony of a incinerator plant burning down on itself. So this wouldn't be a panel in 2026 if I didn't have to mention AI at some point. So AI keeps getting inserted into every policy conversation we've been having, whether it belongs there or not. So I'll ask directly to all of you, does the sovereign infrastructure debate change meaningfully when we're talking about the infrastructure being used to train models or process sensitive data? Anyone have thoughts on that?
I think it's your turn to go first.
Your turn to go first.
Wow, didn't even hear the bus come by. Okay, I will answer it slightly differently. So I look at AI, again, back to my teaching background, I look at AI as a classroom of children, right? Each individual AI made by a different model would be each individual child, but globally. And what I would say that the first 40 or 50 years of artificial intelligence in its oldest form, the first machines started learning, was that kind of preschool phase. And then when ChatGPT got released to the world, that was kind of like the first day at kindergarten, right? Out in the world, you've been raised at home and taken care of and all that kind of stuff. And now out there it goes. Maybe a little bit earlier than it needed to be, but it was released into a structure of supports and stuff, right? But if we take that, we've seen a couple of it. We had the early adopters, we had people looking at it, but then we had those, it shows great promise. And you see that in some, K to 6 kids. You're like, that one's switched on, gonna do great things, right? Oh yeah, okay, that one over there, right? Like we start kind of seeing these kinds of things. And maybe we're at that point of kind of like junior high now, right? Like we're starting to see like, ooh, there's some bad influences being brought into this. There's some good influences. There's tons of great potential. What are we going to do, right? I would not give my tax information to a grade 7 kid and have them do it. So I kind of like that kind of mentality. So I think we're at that phase, right? So when it comes back to that as well, teaching and responsible parenting, I think that's how I'm looking at AI. This doesn't really answer your question specifically, but I think it's an approach and a mindset that I'm trying to bring apart. And it's one of the highest areas of risk, right? I can't think of anything else that has the same level of potential of harm that we don't regulate, right? Are we at the point of that risk? Are we actually negligent as a government, as a people, as adults, right? So those are my questions, right? It's changing the mentality of treating it the way it is right now, understanding that the potential is still there. And the last panel, the presenter was saying, everyone's moving faster, to which my parent voice will say, all your friends are jumping off the bridge. Are you going to jump too? So just a different idea.
Jump over. So I think it's readily apparent that AI privacy is sort of the driving policy force right now behind a lot of what's taking place within government. When we see the strategy there that will come sometime soon, that I'm sure there'll be some amount of emphasis on investment and the like. But for those that are focused on law and policy, it will be centrally around AI regulation, online harms, and privacy. And I think, to try to answer your question, I think there are major issues that we ought to be thinking about, especially, let's say, on the privacy side. Seems to me for some this sort of running assumption that, well, when we get an AI strategy with privacy, that's going to mean that we have the updated, stronger privacy rules, perhaps riffing on what we saw in the last bill, the Bill C-27, that included both AI and privacy. And that may well be the case, but I'm left increasingly to wonder whether it will be fit for purpose. In the one side, and I think it's helpful to think of, let's say in the context of AI and privacy, helpful to think of this both in sort of the input side and the output side. On the input side, the notion of learning models and the like, where there has been a lot of focus. If you haven't been paying attention globally, Japan just last week passed new privacy legislation that makes it far easier for AI companies to use data without concerns for some of the privacy. They want to become, the stated goal of that government is to become the easiest place to facilitate AI development in the world. The UK has tried to lessen some of the restrictions. Even the EU is seeking to limit some of the kind of regulatory framing that they had around AI and privacy. And so you've got 3 jurisdictions that were amongst the most privacy protective that typically we would have looked to and said, this is the model that we want to follow. And suddenly they're heading in a different direction than they were back when we were thinking about C27. And so we have this tension that will exist on the input side, on the learning model side, where on the one hand we want government. I know the government's made it clear they want to ensure that we've got a regulatory framework that is attractive to AI development and the economic benefits that might arise. I think that a year or two ago you would have said, well, that is not in tension with strong privacy rules. Now there are challenges that didn't exist in terms of some of those what some of the global frameworks look like today. Even more, and we spend very little time talking about it, is the output side. So people tend to think of, or some people tend to think of AI from that ChatGPT kindergarten phase, right? So what ChatGPT was like when you first jumped on and it told you that the model was last trained a year before, and so it doesn't have the most active information. Everyone knows nowadays that's not what happens. We know with inference, it goes out and it's a far better search functionality than most search provides. Well, if we think back to the days, there was a professor, she's at Harvard now, Latanya Sweeney, who more than 25 years ago talked about the risk that existed with all series of different data that was de-identified and that individually could not be re-identified. You couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again, so to speak. And she did work back in the late 1990s even that talked about if you found ways to combine these pools of information, you could re-identify de-identified data. Today, this is now increasingly trivially easy with the inference kinds of tools that are available in a Claude or some of the other services that are out there. Well, what does that mean to what has been one of the fundamental premises of privacy law about the way you comply is you de-identify data, it's now safe for use, and you're off to the races. Can you have de-identified data effectively if we've got the tool set to re-identify much of that data? Now, that's one of the things privacy law ought to be taking a look at, thinking about what are the standards. And we've tried a little bit to talk about what it means to re-identify, de-identify data, but not at the kind of scale and speed that AI allows for. And so there is a very strong correlation between the kinds of issues that we are thinking about right now and AI and privacy. But I'm not sure that we have had the kind of granular, sophisticated conversation from a privacy perspective. And I have some concerns that we are going to be presented with roughly what we got a couple of years ago. And I'm not wholly convinced that it actually is going to be fit for purpose.
Okay, that was chilling. So I'm going to take a more popcorn approach. No, it's good. So I'm going to start by being a different kind of downer. So just to bring us back to the theme, someone earlier today mentioned how it's not going to be a digital divide anymore. It's going to be an AI divide. I actually think we're going to preserve the digital divide, unfortunately, and then also have an AI divide. So we did a survey. It's a while back now, but it was 2021. So it's still, if you're thinking about this, and there's data that shows that folks who are living on low incomes will trade off their food and medicine budgets to be able to afford communications. It's peak pandemic. So services are all online. So there's no more crucial time to be online. It's locked down. Stores are closed. You can't go to the library to get free internet, all of those things. In the buildings that we surveyed of Ottawa community housing tenants, 22.5% of them had no home, had no internet connectivity either from their phone or with home internet. So we're not even approaching an AI divide at that point. We're talking about folks who can't even get access to email. And so I just want to sort of ground us again in that because that's the stakes, right? And then on top of that, those things are only exacerbated, obviously, because you can't get better at AI if you're, using A and W Wi-Fi when you can and sort of trying to do what you can on the fly, or using very expensive mobile data to bring us back to affordability. The other thing I want to say, this is why it's popcorn, because this is distinct, but we have a tendency, I feel like, in a lot of internet conversations to talk about folks who use it as users and kind of consumers. And again, coming from community radio, I really like the shift to seeing people, yes, they are listeners in that context, but they are also producers. And so Rita Rockcliffe Community Resource Center, which is based here in town, has an AI seniors art program. So they're teaching seniors how to use AI by creating art. But while doing that, there's all the social inclusion but it's not just learning to use the tools. You start to think about, like, why are the tools doing this, or how does it work, and how do I iterate? We talked about, again, some of that sort of black box or understanding how things work. I think that's really crucial. The third thing I want to say, and this is a brand new within the last month thought for me. So the word ambition has been thrown around a lot today, and also this idea about innovation. So one thing is, I think we don't think enough about service innovation, just straight technical innovation. So ways of delivering things that are different, even if they're building on existing technologies, is still innovative. Where was my other point related to this? Come on, Shelley. And then, and then ambition, which is to say, is there a community AI? Like, my first instinct is always to be like, what does that look like if there's a community option? And so I don't know, but I'm intrigued, and I think it's worth looking at. Is that a decentralized thing? Is that, I don't know. I know that there are researchers in Canada who are interested in the idea of a community or researcher-based cloud. So, is that the kind of thing that could be leveraged and grow for this? So those are my popcorns. Yeah.
Just quickly answer by saying that it's not called community AI. It's described often as public AI.
There you go.
And public AI does have any number of people that are really trying to push it. The Mozilla Foundation has been strongly pushing it, for example. We've got a number of other groups. I'm on the board of Internet Archive Canada, and Brewster Kale at Internet Archive likes to talk about the fact that Internet Archive has probably the second largest potential large language model. We can debate the provenance of all that information on the Internet Archive, but nevertheless, it's massive, and his goal is to seek to create public large language models that are outside the realm of some of the large players. So there is, it's not at the use level in terms of community, but there is very much a desire to find alternatives to the open AIs and Anthropics of the world, for sure.
Giving back rather than extracting. Yeah.
Until it gets bought and monetized. Whoops, that was out loud. So I don't think there'll be a separate digital divide. I think it will supercharge the existing digital divide. Yeah, and there's a couple of factors in that, in simple things, and it's trade-offs again, right? So even because the internet and its services are getting more complicated and more dangerous, we have a countermeasure, multi-factor authentication. Assumptions. That assumes a lot of things. It assumes, you're on one platform. I'm going to text you an SMS message to another platform. Yeah. I have another thing, and I have the digital skills and literacy and all that kind of stuff to deal with that, blah, blah, blah. So also, and a shout out to policymakers as well, as more and more services get streamlined and brought into just the digital realm, if you don't have people who have access to that, then you are increasing the number of people who don't have access to those services. So I think where we possibly could be, getting a wave where we get more people who are technically disconnected. If we look at it from a human rights point of view, again, back to the digital commons, back to the common good, those kinds of ideas, we have both human rights to and from things, right? We have human rights to access the internet, because that's where communication and information and all of these kinds of things are happening more and more than in public. So if you can't participate in public and it's only on the internet, you should have that right to access it. We also should have human rights from things like surveillance, right? This goes back to the privacy laws, right? So yes, I would like the Netflix, but no, I would not like to be surveilled in my living room. Thank you very much, right? So we do cybersecurity watches a lot of stuff coming into the castle, But what about everything going out right now, right? How much information is being bled out, and where's it going, right? Back to the power, back to the money, back to the politics, right? So that kind of an idea, I think, needs to be in our mind and in our decision making.
And that's a great point. I know running my own home network, watching the amount of places my TV tries to go, my TV trying to send logs all over the world, it's shocking, right? And I have it all blocked, but most people aren't that technical at home. So where's all their data going? What's being done with it? Back on track into Joel and Shelley first. So community networks like FreeNet and some of the others exist partially because the market failed to serve certain populations. When the federal government funds infrastructure through incumbents, does that actually help you, or does it crowd out a model that was already working?
Oh.
No, I don't want to go first. I'm just giving you a second. I'm giving you a second to internalize some of your comments.
Whenever there is increased or improved connectivity, we count that as a win. So that's my first thing. And it sounds like the polite and right answer, and it is, but it's also true. I don't think what we had was working because we had the wholesale model. So that's why we're transitioning to the community network. And again, back to I don't think community networks are the answer. I think they are part of the answer. The failures for me of the big investments is that they overinvest in the big players. They don't regulate or require enough. So the government is paying Bell to connect rural communities with no requirements related to IXP connectivity, with no affordability requirements, just straight up, hey, we're going to give you money so you can access a new market. Like, that's sort of bananas on the face of it. Yeah, so that's kind of my concern with it, is just that it distorts, for sure. It distorts the market. It makes our work harder. And my colleague Andrew is here, and a point that he tends to make, network investments, I mean, the reason the government has to subsidize the rollouts to those communities is because there isn't otherwise a market-based initiative for those to go. So the incumbents will put their focus, their energy into where there are markets, which then just deepens those market failures. So again, better regulations, a more diverse or open sort of funding model, and ideas around service innovation. And small players are sometimes going to seem like more of a hassle. They're a hassle on probably the giving them money and, the challenges to build. There was a network that they got provincial and some federal funding, 307 Net. My understanding is that they don't exist anymore. And they got $4 million so that they could connect Cantley here in town. And then Bell invested in that same network area, and they, as far as I know, don't exist anymore. And so that looks like it's a failure of the community organization that's behind it. And it's very clearly, to me at least, a systemic failure that says it's going to be a little bit more work on the front end, but you're going to get a lot more dividends on the back end by that multiplicity, by different, ways of being and doing.
So a practical example, the North End Connect project started basically in a building in the north end of Winnipeg. And when we were brought in, it was during the pandemic, and this organization works with children, and the children obviously were all sent home to work from home, but they didn't have the connectivity, they didn't have the devices. So when we got to the building, though, there was also social housing in the building. There's 30 or so units in the building. And when I looked at the infrastructure, there was already fiber to the building and coax to the building. Rogers Shaw at the time was all the way to the apartment. There's usually you get to an apartment block and they're paying to do interior, not gold, conduit, coax, fiber all the way to the apartment. Go to all the actual people who lived in the apartments and ask them if they had connectivity, and they said they couldn't afford it, because when you get social housing, you get the power and the water and the heat, but you don't get the internet. So there's all of the physical infrastructure was in that building. We had to bring in a third provider with another line because obviously we shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't have to have done the network part at all. But because we can't play on the other networks, we obviously had to start from scratch and build our own. The other thing about it is, the last thing about that is the irony is if you could afford to pay the bill to get the internet from either of those packages, even the cheapest package, you wouldn't qualify for the housing. So you'd be kicked out of the room, right? So anyway, the other part of it is the things that community networks do well is the trust level, the human to human. But you don't find me a funder who will fund social return on investment. Show me a funder who prioritizes 10 or 100 people who deeply were changed by the project over 1,000 who just kind of went to a class and learned how to click a mouse or something, right? Like the funding models themselves prioritize things that these projects don't do well and don't give any value to the things that they do exceptionally well.
So obviously we have some challenges. For each one of you, what is one concrete policy change that you would prioritize to make sovereignty, access, and affordability work together?
So, Michael, yeah. Or do you want both? No, it's fine, but I'll cheat and give more than one. Yeah. No. So I guess I'll start by saying at a high level, I'd like to see sovereignty actually be a policy, not a slogan. And I think part of the problem that we face around the policy discussions, around when we see political set get involved, is it's primarily a label or a slogan. It's not actually trying to identify what are the policies that we're seeking to achieve. But you asked for policy, so I'll give you two ones. Is obvious because I already raised it, and that is I do think we need to address privacy, but I think we need to deal with privacy as we see it now and as we can try to foresee to the extent to which we can where things are headed. I think that's an exceptionally difficult challenge, but I think it's absolutely critical. Data is obviously at the heart of much of what's taking place here, and our rules are quite literally more than 25 years old by now. They are simply outdated. We have no enforcement mechanisms whatsoever to speak of. I don't think anybody credibly seeks to argue that our current set of rules are up to the challenge that we face right now, and they weren't up to the challenge 5 or 10 years ago. They certainly aren't now. The other thing I think I would point to would be, I think we need we need an AI Transparency Act. And to me, that has the opportunity to cover a number of different things. I've said this in other venues before, but just to give you a couple of kinds of things that I would love to see included within that AI Transparency Act. We had a lot of public discussion in Canada in the aftermath of the Tumbler Ridge shooting and the AI chatbots and the prospect of new regulations. As I raised concerns about where some of that discussion was headed in terms of online harms, but at a minimum, it shouldn't take a minister a meeting with company executives to know what the company's policy was in dealing with these kinds of issues. And so there is, I think, a utter lack of transparency associated with many of these policies, how they are implemented, how they are enforced. This applies not just for AI companies, but social media companies and some of the other larger players as well. But within the AI context, I think it's critically important. Another element, one of the other hats I tend to wear, involves copyright-related issues. There was a report issued just yesterday from the Heritage Committees talking about culture in AI. That report calls for new reforms, seeking new levels of remuneration, but as part of the use of works within large language models. But it also speaks to the need for creators to be able to exercise their rights with respect to when their works are included. And I would absolutely agree with that notion. I think, of course, creators should have the right to opt out of the use of their works if they see fit. At the moment, in many instances, they're unable to exercise those rights because they don't necessarily know whether their works have been used. And then it is difficult to exercise it as well, let's say on the internet, when we by and large use the same signaling mechanism for search as we do for AI. Everyone should have the ability to say, I'm comfortable with having my materials indexed for search purposes, but I don't want it used for AI inference purposes or AI learning purposes, not inference so much, but learning purposes. Well, I'd like to see that develop. But anyway, AI Transparency Act would ensure that those uses are made publicly available so that people have the right to make choices. And it might be that they choose to say, I'm comfortable with this being used by a public AI model. I am not comfortable with this being used by Meta's AI model, to pick one of a number of these larger AI companies. That seems to me to be perfectly reasonable. And that need for transparency, which crops up in a number of different places, I think would be a really positive step forward from a regulatory perspective.
So if I had to pick one thing, I think it would be, well, I'm going to say one thing and then divide it into two. So I think it's to sort of almost, we're not in love with the idea that there's only one or two big players who can save us, but we think it's a necessary compromise that we have to keep making. So I was going to say fall out of love with that idea, but I don't think we're in love with it. But like give up on the idea of one or two big players and solutions. And so for me, what that means is really fostering better regulation. So again, that can be constraining regulation and that can also be enabling regulation. So I think that's really powerful. And so sliding over then would be understanding that there is a need, not just a place, but a need for local and community owned infrastructure and organizations, that they need funding, that they need that regulatory support, and that they are sometimes doing a version of the same thing, but also doing a different thing, and that the whole system is stronger when you have this, panoply of players.
I think that the single solution to clearly at least two different groups, right? We have a place where the market works and there's a place where the market doesn't work, but we have one policy for everything. So there's going to be a point where this one size fits all kind of mentality. And I think that innovation, and again, that word came up again, and I am growing dislike of it. If the government is truly wants innovation, then fund all innovation, not just innovation that leads to profit. If you want to find innovation, you find it in a small town, in a community club or a church basement, or some kind of a group like that where they're actually doing stuff. But that's some of the hardest things to fund, and that should have the respect enough that it also shouldn't have to be done voluntarily. Right? If we do truly, there's that whole thing, don't tell me your priorities, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what your priorities are. If we think that communities are actually important, then fund them. And if you're looking to fund through digital innovation, that can be found at the community level, but the output is going to be social. And it's going to be very difficult to see, and it's not going to be the same from place to place. It's complex, right? So if you really mean it, government or funders or whoever, then fund all innovation.
Great responses. Given the importance, and you've touched, I think everyone's touched on the importance of digital connectivity, is it time for us to treat it like a regulated utility and mandate access to everyone?
Woo! I don't know. I mean, I don't want to go to business.
But I heard here. So clearly that reads the room nicely. I think that your example of the housing where we covered heat and covered those basic utilities but didn't cover connectivity sort of is the answer to that question. I mean, it's quite clear that connectivity is in our current society as essential as some of those other kinds of utilities. And so whether we say that there's a universal right or that we mandate something, making it very clear that nobody gets left behind in this, and this happens either through the private sector or gap fill through community groups or through government programs. It's the same talk we've had for a very long time, but the import of this has only grown.
Okay. I just remembered what I used to always say. And it gets back to housing. That's what made it click. So there are places, I'm rusty. I used to be on the board of a not-for-profit housing organization, but there were portable subsidies that you can bring to different. So they could be commercial, they could be like an individual landlord. It could be a not-for-profit landlord. It could be a huge complex, whatever. And you got to bring that subsidy with you. And the states did this for a while. And I'm pretty sure a lot of the good things that they were doing have been rolled back, including this. So that kind of portable subsidy for those who need it most, I think would be crucial. We do have what looks on the face of it like a program, which is Connecting Canadians. It's a voluntary program that is supported by ISED, but it effectively, we can't participate in it because as a voluntary program, it trades on the idea and the structural inequities of the market. That means that incumbents can participate and we can't, basically, because I would still have to pay Bell, for instance, the full tariff rate for a line, but then I would have to sell it for $10. And so having a sort of, let's get rid of what looks good on paper and let's meaningfully address connectivity. Some people are never going to be able to really afford the internet that they need. So let's create a subsidy. Let's make it portable between providers, and then you get that competition for service as well. So if they want to go with Bell over us, then that's great for them, and so that's the kind of competition I can support.
A while ago, I stopped saying the answer to the previous question was to nationalize the backbone. Right, that seemed like a good idea at the time, but my question, and the reason I've kind of fallen off on it, is I eventually get tired of screaming into the wind. But we don't even regulate the industry. This is going to be super unpopular. Technically, I don't know of another thing that has this now, especially now with AI, this level of risk and impact to people everywhere and the planet, ecologically, humans, all of that isn't regulated. Law, medicine, the trades, everything else, right? And it is regulated by the market. Like, there are standards in place. But again, the argument is usually most made by urban centers, built up areas. But as you get farther and farther, as you get farther into the digital divide, it is unregulated, right? You need an electrician to get the power into the room to plug the server in. You might even need a plumber to do the water cooling if it's a water cooled thing. But inside the box, right, that's unregulated area. You don't have to have it. We don't have a unified code of ethics in the IT industry, and we don't have one that we're held to. There's no barrier to entry into it. I'm definitely not asking for this, right? I'm just saying that these are questions. How can we be surprised when the results that we are getting and the problems that we are having those choices are being made by people who don't have a common do no harm, right? We don't agree on this. It's almost like the battle about education, right? The school system's been teetering back and forth forever because a certain part of the population believes that schools are there to make workers, and another part of the population is there that schools are there to make well-rounded human beings who also go to work, right? Those are fundamentally different things. If two people who don't agree with each other agree on the thing that we're supposed to do, we're going to build a shed together, but we hate each other. End of the day, we can build a shed together because we both believe in that shed. We know we both need that shed. We don't have to agree, right? But the opposite. If you're wanting a car, you want to build a car, and I want to build a shed, no matter how much we work together, we have fundamentally different things that we're trying to do. So there's only so many resources. There's only so much time. I don't know that we have these things. I don't think we have those fundamental questions talked about enough and or answered. So it's a roundabout way to basically saying, even if we said, yeah, we were going to do it, I don't think we could possibly get there.
Shed with wheels. I love it. So as we're nearing the end of our time here, I'm going to ask each panelist in order to go through and just give their final thoughts, anything they want people to walk away with today after listening to all this. We'll start with Michael.
Sure. You were generous. I was able to rant as much as I wanted to. I guess I would say this. There is a lot happening in the digital policy space, not just the AI policy, but lawful access that is currently before the House. We will see online harms come forward. We desperately need people to pay attention and to speak out. I have a post up this morning that speaks about the first House debate on lawful access, which was pathetic. from not just the government, but from the opposition parties as well. And so issues around mandated metadata retention for up to a year, which has been found to be unconstitutional and disproportionate in other jurisdictions, is on the agenda. Concerns around systemic vulnerabilities and the risks of putting that in our network is on the agenda. And government so far hasn't really been been forced to answer around those issues, much less what we're likely to see around online harms, much less what we're likely to see or potentially will see around AI policy. So the coming months now with a majority government is going to be critically important. And so I'd urge everyone to both stay informed and get active.
I had it and I lost it. It's really easy in our day-to-day lives to revert to a kind of everyone model of thinking. So like, well, everyone has internet or like blah, 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 blah. And it happens a lot at conferences like this. It happened throughout the day. I'm not going to call out anybody in particular because that would just be nasty. It's just a thing that even I fall into all the time. So when you sort of feel yourself doing that, I would think about the folks who are being left behind and who does everyone not include right now? And what are the costs of the people who we don't include when we talk about everyone? And sometimes this even comes out like, oh, everyone hates Netflix or everyone again, it's just like one of those things where you can be like, whoop, who do I mean when I say everyone and who isn't included? I think that would be my biggest thing. And then my other one I'm just going to reinforce the same thing, which is like small can be beautiful and it doesn't have to be the whole answer to be a significant part of the solution.
Absolutely. This is not the internet I was promised. My point is, I think we need more of these discussions. We need more of us. I feel like there was a fire in the 90s and the 2000s that was there, the community focus, the promise of the things, the positives that could be used for the internet and the services on it. And I feel we're down to kind of we're down to the embers. So I think that we all need a collective action to remember those early days, go back to our origins, and breed more of us. I have 3 kids, so I've done my part. They've heard this rant a million times, so they're on board. I think that we just need to rekindle that fire and don't obey in advance. Right? This is not inevitable. This is not a default. There are other options, and we have the ability to make that choice, and that is autonomy. And if we all had it, it would be sovereignty.
Thank you all very much for the great thoughts. Great panel discussion. Thank you, everyone.